Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're in the world. In this session, in this webinar, we're going to talk about 3 questions that are good to answer in order to jumpstart your data center transformation. So as an agenda, those are the 3 questions. We're going to look at what you could do with your legacy infrastructure and how do you approach it. We'll address the question on what sort of expertise are needed for moving into AWS and how do you manage your applications once you get there. And then also lastly, but not leastly, a realistic approach on how you approach a transformation of this kind. There is a Q&A panel in your webinar too. Feel free to ask questions at any time. We'll answer them at the end of it. So with that, let's go and get started. So about me, my name is Sri Rajan. I'm a principal architect in Rackspace. I've been over 15 years in IT, several of those at Rackspace as well. Been involved in the cloud world for about 7 years now in a variety of different ways, OpenStack, AWS, things like that. I'm professionally certified in AWS, and I've worked with a lot of enterprise customers in terms of transformation into cloud, building complex architectures and so forth. Having worked in IT, safe to say I do have a healthy level of cynicism with technologies and adoption of it, but I also bring a bit of pragmatism in terms of how you use it. From a personal perspective, I'm originally from India. I grew up there and then left India for Texas, where I spent some time, about 9 years there, doing my master's in computer science. I also worked in Rackspace US a bit and on some of the companies in the US. And for the last 9 years, I've been living in the UK, in London, and there, again, working for Rackspace. And my work at Rackspace has gone from working in technical support, service delivery. I've done a lot of professional services work, worked as a cloud architect for our AWS business unit and so forth. And in my most current role, I'm a product architect that's helping build offerings for customers. And some of the questions that we answer today are very much related to the type of products and tooling that we're building to help with. So let's start with the first question. What should you do with your legacy infrastructure? Probably the flippant answer is to bury your head in the sand and pretend that it goes away. The reality is a lot of enterprises do that. I can empathize with it. I personally worked at a university in the US where our entire student registration system was running on a VAX VMS that was older than me, to be very honest. But there was a lot of inertia in terms of moving, lots of challenges in there. And every enterprise has this, right? Has this legacy infrastructure that is probably critical from a business perspective, but it may be fragile. It may be something that people are not keen on touching. It's definitely not cool in many ways. So there is a tendency to sort of ignore it and not do anything about it. The other thing you could do is you could rebrand this as Vintage Cloud and say, oh, great, your cloud transformation is done, job done, let's go. But jokes aside, the simple answer is to say, you start planning today. It will never get easier than today in many ways. Expertise on these systems will run out. You may lose through staff attrition, just knowledge. Hardware may get outdated, but you may not get replacement parts. Softwares, licenses or software versions may reach end of life. All those things are ticking. So in many ways, this problem is going to get harder every day that's passing. So it's best to start today, have something in plan, even if it means that the path transformation is 12, 18 months from now. Starting today would help you plan that and reach that conclusion more effectively. So besides the high-level pitch of starting today, let's look at what do you need to do. So let's start with a business case for these things. And this is often overlooked in the sense that it becomes a technical problem for migration, whereas it's really a business problem of moving an application. And so it's good to start with that. So starting with a business case usually means interviewing stakeholders, not just in the IT and the engineering team, but also business owners, people who are in the critical path in terms of revenue, for example, customer services and things like that. It's good to understand and interview these people just to understand what sort of applications are running on these legacy infrastructure. And you may end up doing this on a per application basis because, again, each will vary significantly. And in doing so, will help you draw out some of the business value of the application, right? So you'll be able to understand better how critical this application is, what happens when it breaks, what's the impact of revenue, what's the impact of customer satisfaction. All those things that are probably important when you make the next decision on what to do with this application need to be drawn out first. And then you can also answer questions like, what is the cost of maintaining status quo? So if I do nothing today, what's the cost? And often the answer to this, or the short-term answer to this, is there is very less cost because you probably a lot of these are legacy infrastructure is already on hardware that has been paid for example. You may have already paid for these licenses. There may be some ongoing maintenance costs, but they'll be pretty static. But the other way to answer this question is, what's the cost of doing nothing in terms of future, right? So when certain inflection points are reached, for example, say the data center is shutting down or the hardware is reaching end of life, what's the cost at that point in terms of change? And also there's a cost in terms of not modernizing these things. So maybe everything works today, but what happens in 12 months' time when you want to release features at a much faster rate, when you need to be more agile in terms of changes to these applications? Does your status quo help with that? And this is an important question in cloud because it's not purely about saving costs. Often it's also about driving value to the application and business by adding more features, leveraging other stuff that the cloud or AWS provides as well. If you move on further, and there's a lot of these questions, and we'll cover some today. There's probably a lot more that you can go. Each of these questions can prompt other questions. But the next level is to understand some of the application characteristics. So now you're jumping into a bit of the technical side of things. So you're saying, what does this application look like? How is it used? What are its peak periods? What are its low periods? When do you need more capacity? When do you not need that capacity? All those characteristics are good to understand because that'll help understand the current situation. It'll also help you understand what the target needs to be. And then if you go further, and if you're looking at a typical 3-4 tier application stack in terms of a presentation layer, maybe an application layer, a data layer, and so forth, just understanding what those tiers are, what technologies are being used, and so forth. And then as you go through that, you can also start answering these questions. Which of these tiers can be adopted to a more cloud way of thinking? Maybe there are services that are exact match. For example, let's say you're running MySQL on a physical server. That could easily be moved to RDS, for example, or AWS Aurora, for example. On the other side, you may have a very bespoke Java application that's using custom libraries and other stuff, which may need to stay as it is, maybe just running on a virtual machine by maintaining all that stack on day one. And then you need to go into the low-level details. So what sort of VM sizes are these? What's storage size, the number of VMs? This would usually be translated into sort of a spreadsheet, so to speak, of list of devices, their associated components, maybe the usage data, stuff like that. This would be important, again, when you model your target infrastructure on AWS, because you'll be able to understand what it's going to cost, what it'll look like, and so forth. Once you have that set of information, usually you could do sort of a cloud readiness assessment. And we do this in terms of an application profiling exercise and say, based on certain criteria and answers that you've given, how ready is the cloud application for cloud? The answer to legacy infrastructure usually is it's never going to be completely ready. There's going to be some tinkering needed, but it's good to understand what that level or what that degree is. And then based on that, you can define a bunch of possible target states. Now, this could be starting with sort of what typically called lift and shift, as in, let me take it exactly as it is, transport that into sort of an infrastructure model running on EC2. And then it could be other target states like, okay, maybe I'm going to move my data layer to a database as a service. Maybe I'm going to move my batch processing to something like Lambda. So there's probably different possible target states. It'll be good to understand those as well. And then once you have the target states, you effectively build the designs for them, and then you can do cost estimates for these target states. So what's your lift and shift infrastructure, what's going to cost, what's going to be your transform infrastructure, and what it's going to cost. Again, it's a good exercise to do that irrespective of whether which one you pick eventually. And then based on these target states, you have to think about what's the migration plan. Designing an infrastructure solution in AWS is job one to do, but really understanding how you're going to get there is what the migration plan does. And often this is an area where things can get quite complicated. So while you can design the infrastructure fairly well, if you have a 10 terabyte database that needs to be moved over in a very short migration window, then you have to start thinking about other things in your migration strategy. So maybe you need to move data through something like Snowball. Maybe you need a low latency fast connection between your on-premise data center and AWS. All those things need to be eked out because they will also reveal the additional cost in terms of tooling that you may need to complete the migration, any additional risks that you're taking as part of this, any of the challenges that you need to overcome. And effectively at this point, you sort of have the total cost model in front of you. So you have what's there in the source, what's the cost of the target, what's the cost of the migration. And this could be put together into sort of a TCO analysis, say, your current cost is this, it's going to cost X to migrate, it's going to cost Y to be in the target state, and you may need to run source and target in parallel for, say, 2 or 3 months for the migration period. And so you can add all these numbers, and you probably get to a number that says, this is effectively what it's going to cost for me to move this legacy application into AWS. And that'll also give you input into areas and when are cost savings really happening. Often drivers into cloud are around cost savings and so forth, but it's good to understand as from a business perspective, the savings happen in year 1, or is it year 2, or is it even later, right? So it's, that way you can educate your business leaders to say, hey, cost is a driver, but really cost savings don't really happen until month 15, for example. And those are just a subset of questions, and we can always go into more detail, but into each of these things. But at a high level, that sets the scene on how would you address the legacy stuff. And once you have done this for, say, all the application under your remit, you then can start figure out some pathways for these applications. So first and foremost would be sort of to retain and retire. This one I would challenge and say this needs a very compelling reason why you're doing it, because often this just means you're delaying the problem further down the road. But there are some examples, maybe a mainframe solution that you're running that can't be moved to AWS, for example. Maybe the application itself is going to reach end of life in 6 months' time, and time to migrate is going to be roughly the same. So then you can say, fine, I'm going to take some short-term pain or risks and then leave it there. But the key thing is when you put an application in this bucket, there needs to be some kind of risk analysis that the business needs to be aware of to say, if I'm doing that, what are the risks that I'm taking, and if they're acceptable from a business standpoint. The next bucket is basically the transition bucket. And this is generally where most of the legacy infrastructure first lands. Very rarely are you going further than that. So because there is a lot of tinkering you need to do to get it even to here. And usually this is acceptable. This still assumes some amount of change. You're not really lifting and shifting everything. Usually you're lifting, doing a bit of tinkering, and then shifting. Examples of this could be an off-the-shelf application, for example, which has to be lifted and shifted because of the way it operates. Maybe your data center is closing in 6 months' time, so really you don't have much time to make large-scale changes, in which case your driver is to say, okay, what is the fastest way to do, and usually transition is the fastest way. And the third bucket would be the transform, and this is usually the ideal end state. So each application may go into a transition state, but may have a transform state later on. But this is where you're making things cloud ready, and you're probably gaining the most value from cloud and AWS. Some examples of this could be like migrating your custom batch processing to Lambda or Glue. Some of this could happen at a very early stage as well. It doesn't have to be that every application needs to go from transition to transform. It all depends on the amount of work you're willing to do, the amount of time it will take to do it, and then that'll help you decide. In the exercises that we've done with customers in these areas, you'll see some very small percentage that really fits into the retain and retire, and usually it is because of some complex reasoning like the mainframe one. About 60%, 70% usually fits in that transition bucket, at least for the initial 6 to 12 month period. And then there's always some stuff that you look at it and say, that could be transformed within 2 weeks with some work put into it. And usually it's better to do it rather than lifting and shifting. So the remainder usually fits into that. And what this will eventually then give you is sort of a high-level plan of all your applications, which buckets they fit in, what the costs are on these things, when will you realize some of the savings, what are the risks in migration, and so forth. So you can start forming some of these plans into it. And then if you take this further and say, okay, now I've done sort of a business case, what do I do next? As in, I have done some application landscaping, I understand my applications in there. In terms of really the next step is to figure out some kind of incentivization internally. So usually this means rewarding teams that could migrate sooner. For example, this could be carrot and stick approach in terms of resources being provided to the team if they're doing certain things better that are aligned to your thinking. Also, don't forget to look externally. Cloud vendors like AWS will often offer credits for POCs and migration and things like that, and that can easily help you with the cost element, at least for a short period of time. The same thing applies to certain partners that are in this space. They can all provide you some help in terms of skill set or credits and so forth. And usually we dictate that pick 3 applications as your first movers. And if possible, in each of the buckets that we discussed before, just so you get a feel of things. Yes, avoid the retain bucket if that's not something you desire, but try to pick 2 different candidates that are different. Avoid your crown jewels. So it's usually too risky to pick the application that is the most critical for your business, the most revenue generating, the most customer facing as your first mover. Unless there is a super compelling reason, avoid those because they're too risky and they often don't, you often haven't learned anything at that point, so you're taking even more risks on that. In the same vein, avoid the easy movers, right? Maybe your executive leadership has a blog that runs on WordPress, it runs on a single VM talking to a single database. Often those are very easy to move. They won't provide you any more insights in terms of what a migration might look like. So picking something in the middle that is semi-complex is always a good exercise because it gives you that initial momentum of moving applications to the cloud, reduces the risk to some extent. You also learn a lot in doing so, which can be then applied to more risky applications. And then effectively, you can start building what you can call an application factory, so to speak, right? So you have your landscape, your grouping, your profiling, and then once you've done a few, you can sort of start a run rate of these applications. And this is, we witnessed this with a lot of customers, where the initial stuff might take a while, it might take a little education, a lot of internal discussions, a lot of work put on. But once you've set that sort of factory in motion, then the remainder of the application sort of transition relatively quickly, relatively easier. So it's always good to think in terms of that, saying, yes, I'm going to do my first movers, but I'm going to do them with the intent that all those first movers are building that factory for me, right? Whether it's reusable templates for infrastructure building, whether it's reusable templates for migration, tooling, and so forth. So that's the way I would end this question, is to say, think in terms of a business case, look at your application profile, look at your first movers, and then lean and end towards building an application factory. And of course, start as soon as possible, because the earlier you start, the better it is for legacy infrastructure. Now let's move on to our next question of the day. So you're talking about expertise that's needed to move into AWS. The simple answer to this, it very much depends on the stage of adoption for AWS, right? So depending on where you are in the adoption curve, the expertise you need may be different. And we'll look into that in the coming slides. But before we go into that, I want to point sort of an infographic that came from a survey that Rackspace did with with hundreds of IT decision makers and IT pros. And some of the questions asked were like, which technologies will have positive impact? So of course, things like automation, cloud security, AI, machine learning, data science all come as on the top, really in both groups. But then if you look at the other side as well, what areas are required, and this is probably more short term, right? When you ask required, is usually I need them now. Some of the cooler concepts like AI, machine learning don't feature that much. But some of the others like automation, database administration, for example, cloud security are featured in there. So that's sort of skill set that in general the industry is trying to look for, right? In cloud world, automation always plays a key role. So it's good to have engineers who have programming background, who have worked with automation technologies like CloudFormation, Terraform, and so forth, things like that. And then security is always a concern. It's a lot of concern originally when cloud originated in terms of it being less secure. I think some of those myths have been busted in over the years, but it still requires an element of making sure any compliance in the enterprise, any security concerns are all addressed as part of it. So there's a definite gap in there as well. And then if you start looking at a timeline, so going back to my initial point on depends on where you are, the resources that you need, the expertise that you need may be very different. So let's take like a sort of a cloud journey example and say you are an enterprise that has done nothing in the cloud yet. You're just looking at it. You've seen some of the materials coming from AWS reInvent or other such CIO, CFO magazines. You're interested, but as an organization, you haven't done much at all. So if you're looking at the first 3 months of that, as you embark on it, there's a lot of adoption and planning that needs to happen. And this expertise translates into something you need sort of a business consultant who can help understand the dynamics of your business and help sort of build a plan on in terms of how you're going to enable your business in cloud, how you're going to educate people, how you can people trained and so forth. You probably need a technical consultant who can do the same thing from a technical perspective. You need a project manager who can help manage all these things because typically in a large enterprise, there are lots of stakeholders, lots of business units. There's a lot of wrangling that needs to happen across these groups to get them aligned. A lot of reporting that needs to happen to the execs and so forth. You need a lot of training resources who can train the business and the technical users on a variety of things. Because this phase is quite critical because this is where you're injecting cloud into the lifeblood of the organization. And you're making sure the organization is getting excited. There's a bit of evangelism, a bit of training, a bit of skills and capability being built so that the next stages are easier and you have enough skill set built for that. The next stage of that is building the foundations. So again, from an enterprise lens, you have maybe hundreds of applications. They all may fit into certain patterns. So it's good to understand some common foundation that they all leverage, right? Maybe there's a common infrastructure layer. Maybe there's a common networking layer with VPNs and so forth. AWS calls this the landing zone, for example, is building that sort of landing zone where applications can land and then operate well is critical. And often doing this right, again, helps in that factory world where it's just a matter of then fitting other things into that sort of landing pattern. And this requires an architect, so somebody who knows AWS very well, somebody who has all the skills needed, has some experience, has some scar tissue in terms of how which decisions work better in the cloud and so forth. So you need an architect, you need an engineer who can take some of those designs and translate that into actual infrastructure. If you're leveraging things like infrastructure as code, this usually means writing CloudFormation templates, for example, or Terraform. And then depending on your area of business, you might need some specialties, right? So if you have a large data set, you have a complex database set up with a lot of other moving parts, maybe you have an ETL processing system, then you would need specialists like data. You often need sort of a security architect who can help with things like the IDSs, the WAF, and the security aspects of the world. And then you'll often need a networking expertise because, again, with enterprises and large businesses, there's often a complex networking setup already in place consisting of VPN, side-to-side tunnels, and so forth. So how do you transpose that into sort of patterns in the cloud, and how do you extend some of those networks into the cloud as well? Now that you build your foundation, then the next bit is basically pretty much moving your workloads. Now this is similar to what we talked before, is moving your legacy stuff so you understand what migration looks like. So you need a migration consultant who has done a lot of migration work, who understands sort of the typical runbooks for migration and so forth. You still need the architect and engineer from before because often you need to design solutions specifically for those workloads. You would need a project manager again because migrations typically need careful planning in terms of outages and business owners being made aware of these changes and so forth. And then some of the technology specialists will again apply depending on the workloads. Moving on to the next stage would be pretty much keeping the lights on, is generally the operations side of things. So this is anywhere from 6 months to pretty much forever. You need somebody who manages these services, so understanding the service metrics, reporting those things if you have SLAs and so forth for your businesses and your customers, managing those things like that. You would need somebody who can keep the lights on 24/7, so react to alerts, fix these alerts either manually or through automated scripting. In a similar vein, you would also need to be able to handle security incidents in a 24/7 basis. So that's sort of the operational structure that you need to put in place with those resources. And then the optimize and change bucket will heavily depend on how much of a change happens in your application, in your stack. It's typical for cloud customers to go through this cycle every 12 to 18 months. If you think about it, every reinvent that AWS launches a whole bunch of products, it'd be good to understand what these products are capable of and see how they can transform existing stuff. Often these services are higher level services, as in they're extending on feature sets. Maybe 2 years ago you were running a Kubernetes cluster yourself. Now you have Amazon EKS that provides the managed services. And similarly, there's tons of services that AWS will keep launching that you look at it and say, that actually fits right into where my applications are listening, and this could save me a whole bunch of problems in terms of operations, in terms of management, and so forth. So keeping that optimization cycle running every 12 months is important, and this usually requires somebody who's now well-versed with that technology. And keep in mind, this technology is relatively new, so it's not something you'd have a lot of experience around, so you probably need somebody who's been playing with these technologies, maybe in the early access world, has done some sort of POCs, maybe the vendors are providing some assistance in that. So it's understanding those things and then applying that learning to your existing application on an ongoing basis. So that is the type of expertise you needed, right? So there's a quite breadth of expertise, and not all of them are needed forever. Some are needed in the early phases of it, some are needed in the later, and this is where you have to figure out how do you flex that capacity and that sort of resources based on when you need it. And then this is where the evolving nature of cloud itself makes things difficult as well. And usually the answer to this is sort of a mix and match model with a combination of teams in-house and stuff that the vendors and partners can provide to help you speed up. Because don't ignore the opportunity cost for something like this. Whereas you may be able to scale up your team on pretty much everything that AWS launches, there's usually a time frame that is required, right? As an individual or as a team, it's quite hard to be an expert across all the services and features that AWS releases. So you are expending time in there in doing so, and in doing so, you're also delaying the value that the business gets in. So it's always good to think about that and saying, what sort of investment can I make, even though it may cost a little bit more, but I can achieve some of those outcomes quicker than having to spend time doing all that myself. So you have to think in those terms of how do you bridge the gap between what you can do in-house and what you can just supplement. Things like migration, for example, once you've done all your migration, you probably don't need that skill set as much. So those things are easier to leverage through partners and do it. And similarly, sort of the optimized stuff could also be something that partners can help with, because you can just say every 12 months, I want you to come down, do a focus workshop, educate all the new services, and then talk to my application teams on how they can transform that as well. So let's move on to the third and the last question for the session. This is basically about a realistic approach to transforming the business. This is a fairly wide and open-ended question. You may get different answers depending on how your enterprise works and how, I guess, in what context you frame this. I'm going to answer this with something that is a bit generic, but probably addresses the larger piece of the puzzle, and also addresses things that maybe are not directly related to transformation, but are quite important overall. They will also address some of the stuff that we already talked today, and then sort of bring it all together into sort of a reusable framework, if you will. And the answer to this, and I'll read this out what's on the screen, is basically build a team of change agents that are backed by executive steering, that are tasked with spearheading and leading the stages of cloud adoption and transformation. The term that can be used to describe this is the Cloud Center of Excellence. If you're familiar with the AWS world, you may have heard this term. Gartner is talking a little bit about this as well. Some of the other cloud providers definitely do this as well. And let's explore this term a little bit and then go back to how this actually answers this question. So let's go by defining objectives of a CCO. This is our view of things. This can be tweaked a bit depending on how you would define these objectives. But from a consistency perspective, a CCOE or a Cloud Center of Excellence should be able to define the activities, the processes, the KPIs for your cloud transformation. So it should be able to plan that for you, provide some structure to do that. It should reduce the risk of cloud adoption. This can be done by ensuring proper coverage of business stakeholders, by ensuring, again, having a proper structure for analyzing risk and so forth. It should help plan the migration order, so it should help feed into that migration factory that we talked about. And then it also needs to define the ongoing activities, so sort of what happens when the application lands in the cloud. What are the activities to sustain success, right? Because getting into AWS would be step one, but maintaining that consistently and making sure things don't get dropped after that is also equally important. So it needs to cover the entire landscape from initial planning, the migration, to ongoing operations. And we're going to answer this with a bunch of blocks. This slide, in my view, brings these things together and hopefully addresses the different areas of concern that you may have. So starting with, you have your cloud platform. This is AWS. This provides you the compute, networking, storage, the databases, the higher level services. And if you think about it, this is actually a very powerful thing already, right? So if you think about the scale at which AWS operates, the number of regions they're in, the geographies that they're serving and so forth, all that's available for you. You could pretty much, it's a given to you, all the heavy lifting or the undifferentiated heavy lifting, as AWS likes to call it, is done for you. So it's now a question of building the stuff needed to make use of that from a business standpoint. And that, in a sense, is what CCO is trying to do, is say, you have your cloud platform. Now, what are you going to do about it and how are you going to use that more effectively? And to start with, you form sort of a CCOE team. This starts with having some executive sponsorship, typically a CTO, CIO sort of person who's championing this cause. And then you need leaders across a variety of functions. This could be finance, architecture, security lead. You need some of the workload owners as part of this. You need operations lead. You need service leaders as well. The actual org structure of a team like this would depend on how the dynamics of the enterprise itself is today. In some enterprises, there are already central teams that are helping govern standards of architecture and operational processes. Usually they would be better fit for this. In some enterprises, this needs to be a sort of a virtual team that is a bunch of handpicked individuals who are collaborating to build that. And so building that team may vary by organization, but it's important to have a central team that initially starts on it. And eventually the aim of this team should be to spread that knowledge across the organization and not be the sort of the bottleneck itself, is to be able to educate the other groups and then sort of bring cloud across the whole organization. But it may have to start as a sort of a virtual or a core team, so to speak. And then the team can embark on 4 distinct work streams. These are in some order. They could happen in parallel depending on some of the specifics of it. The first bit is what we already talked about today, is sort of the business case element. So while we touched on sort of an application level business case in terms of answering some questions and understanding that from an individual application and moving that to the cloud model, it's also good to understand sort of a business case from a perspective of what are the enterprise drivers for cloud, not specific to an application. What does AWS give you on the whole, right? So, and what's needed to make that happen? And often this goes into things like educating your people, training people, changing maybe your processes, maybe the way you procure stuff, maybe the way you lifecycle manage it, and then of course defining some of the technology changes that may need to happen in the way you consume as well. Of course, you can still do the cost modeling for some of these things and understand what it's going to cost, understand sort of the TCO, TCA model in terms of that. But a business case activity is always a good one to embark on as a first objective of CCOE, because that informs you some of the whys. Why are you doing this in the first place? And then it informs the activities after that. The next set of next work stream is effectively a cloud enablement. This would, again, depending on the journey that you are in the cloud, if you're very early, there's an element of evangelism that needs to happen. This usually translates into things like lunch and learn, hack days, again, getting an organization excited about the cloud in the first place, and then translating that into more focused business and technical training. So if you look across your enterprise and define which roles are there that are critical for success of these and what are the training needs of these roles. And this would start with sort of business owners. Think of it like IT managers, development team managers, finance people. All of them also need a level of education because that can often be overlooked. It's easy to jump into the technical bits of it, understand how that works, and ignore elements like how does pricing work in the cloud? How do you budget for something that is more utility pricing? How do you work through sort of a pricing model that flexes over the year at different times and so forth? So there's an element of education that needs to happen to business users. The technical training is a bit more straightforward. You have to pick your developers, your system administrators, your network admins, maybe your database admins, and then of course group them into the right buckets and then figure out what sort of training they need, right? Typically cloud fundamentals, additional training on specific technologies that they have. And usually those also lead into sort of a certification tracks as to, okay, I want to get my organization certified to some extent. That way I have people who are actually AWS certified and have the skill set that I can rely on to do it. So there's a degree of enablement that needs to happen across the organization. The next bit is the technical design. So the technical design workstream focuses on what are all the considerations that I need to do to build sort of that cloud foundation. So again, when I talked about the landing zone that AWS talks about, is sort of like sort of relates heavily to this. So if you look across the organization or across the enterprise and say, if I were to build something that is repeatable, that all my application teams can consume in a consistent manner, what is that? And the answer to that is usually some kind of technical blueprint. This would take into account things like account structure, things like identity and access, things like remote access and VPNs. How are you going to do shared services, for example, with Active Directory, monitoring, data protection, and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of things that it needs to do. All those lead into sort of reference architectures. And then the reference architectures is what then gets used by application teams in a repeated way. So that's the key deliverable of a technical design aspect of it. And something that very closely aligns with the technical design is an operational model. This talks about what happens after the application has landed. How are you going to measure metrics across these things, whether it's based on cost, availability, and so forth, and how are you going to report it? How are you going to do some of the traditional bits like change problem and incident management? And again, an enterprise may already have some of these processes worked out. It's now a matter of adopting them to the cloud and then managing it. Then there are areas like lifecycle management, capacity management, which are less difficult in cloud because of the nature of the cloud, but do still need some emphasis put on it. How are you going to manage cost on an ongoing basis? How are you going to manage design on an ongoing basis? what sort of automation is needed to implement some of these changes and incidents. And then if you're doing cross-charging across different teams, what sort of billing models you need to incorporate. So technical design and operational models go hand in hand often, and they may borrow and lean on each other to guide and then come together to help you design your blueprints and then your operational blueprints for ongoing basis. And then the last component in this, very critical, comes last in the flow of the slide, but can often come very much as the first thing, is sort of a cloud management office. This is the project and program governance that sort of sits across all these things. The important project management work in terms of reporting on statuses, reporting on risks, reporting on delays, making all the stakeholders inform all those changes is super critical. Again, as you can imagine, in an activity like this, you may have 50, 100 stakeholders across the business, all contributing different ways, all need to be informed in different ways. And something like a cloud management office or a CMO is instrumental in making sure that they're informed and all the sort of the cogs are moving towards the same goal. Quickly on this, so I talked about the 4 blocks. Now your mileage as an enterprise might vary. You may say I want to do all 4 of this as part of CCOE, and typically that's the advice I would give. If you have already done something before or you already have something, you could skip some of these modules and say, I've already checked that box through this, so I'd rather focus on this as part of this. And then as an extreme example, some customers are also looking at, I have all that, I just want to start landing applications and figuring out the operational model, in which case you just focus on the last 2 bits of it. But even in those areas, I would say the other blocks need to be addressed somehow, because often without that, success of cloud adoption can be quite limited. And to put CCOE in the context of the migration factory that we talked about when we talked about legacy application, the CCOE fits perfectly in there because it effectively informs everything that you would do in the migrations. If you've built your technical design, you build your operational model, then every application that you're migrating can borrow from that library of blueprints, can borrow from those infrastructure templates if you're doing automation, can borrow from those change processes, the incident management processes. All those can be borrowed because that makes the going into the cloud that much smoother. And that's the key role that CCOE plays, is also feeding into sort of that migration funnel. So if I want to sort of leave this or end this question by some takeaways, what I would answer with anything like CCOE, be agile. Try to put together a team, try to deliver things faster. Don't make this an 18, 24-month exercise before you can see the first deliverables, because that often means you've missed the boat, especially in the world of AWS where things are fast changing and new stuff are being released day in and day out. That sort of time frame doesn't really work. And design and implement, that's the advice I would give. Often this can become sort of a bookish exercise where you're churning a lot of documentation which is not being used that much. It's always good to implement these things in actual templates or actual runbooks. That way there is something material that people can reuse, and that often means you're also helping them do some of the lifting in your organization. And then try to deliver something every 3 to 6 months. That should be the prime goal of something like CCOE. What's my first milestone, and how can I achieve that in that short time frame? So that's it for today in terms of answering those 3 questions. If I were to summarize the entire session today and give you some takeaways to think about, consider CCOE as a change engine for transformation. Even if you don't adopt every bit of it, there's a lot of it that makes common sense, and you can easily map that into any existing models or processes that you have. But it provides you a structure where you can look at that and say, I'm doing these things today, these are the gaps, these haven't even started. So at least it gives you sort of a gap analysis of what you are today. From a legacy perspective, nothing better than starting today. Because that, like I said before, it won't get any easier than today. Don't ignore the opportunity cost, and this may sound a bit like a sales pitch, but at the end of the day, partners and providers will help you in the agility side of things. Often a managed service provider or somebody who's worked in the cloud would know the best way to proceed first, rather than somebody who's tried the first time, because you may fail, you may realize some mistakes, you may tweak them, and often you're getting that right maybe the third time, whereas a partner who has done that before can probably share the war stories and have the scar tissue to say, start here, and that your chances of success are high. And the same way, there's a cost to doing nothing. So there's the opportunity cost, and so to take that into account when you think about cost on the whole is to, if I want to do this myself and it's going to cost me less, but it's going to take me 12 months to achieve that, what's the opportunity cost that I've lost by waiting for 12 months there? That's my Twitter handle. That's me on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me. Feel free to send some questions. Of course, you can send some questions in the Q&A tab here as well, and I'll answer them after this. But feel free to reach out to me directly if you want to engage further, and I'll have some questions that you want to discuss with me directly. With that, let me go into the questions tab and then go through some of the questions one by one, and I'll answer them in the order they were received. So the first question repeated for the audience, so how do you see CCOE working in a large enterprise with lots of stakeholders and teams and other such dynamics? How do I see it working? Depends on how it's formed and depends on the organizational structure. So if the structure is kind of loosely decoupled, where there are lots of different teams doing their own bits with varying degrees of success, it might be a bit challenging bringing them together. And often the answer to that is to get some quick wins underway and then start shaping them towards the common goal. It would also vary if you have sort of power silos in your organization. So maybe there are two different regions and they're sort of each building sort of their own flavor of CCOE, and there are reporting structures are not aligned to get them together. In those cases, you may have to start thinking about how do I let them be autonomous to some extent, but bring a degree of alignment initially, maybe do some cross-sharing, and then over time bring them together as well. The next question was, what's the typical time frame for cost savings and migrating to AWS? So I touched on this a little bit when I talked about legacy infrastructure. You would need to do a business case to figure that out. Often you're looking at 9, 12-month windows when that happens. It depends on the degree of transformation you've done, the degree of cost, how soon you migrate, for example. Okay, if you get migrated in a month, it's going to cost you less as opposed to 3. If the cloud vendor like AWS is providing you credits, that offsets the cost a little bit as well. So those factors come into play heavily in this. The next question was, do you recommend any tools to analyze legacy infrastructure? Yes, it depends. I mean, if your footprint is pretty large, then it would make sense to leverage some tools. The tools are not a complete replacement for human-led discovery, but they can do a lot of heavy lifting initially to help position that. Our professional services team use Cloudscape to some extent. We also use some of the tooling that AWS provides, the AWS migration toolkit, because for some use cases that's a perfect fit. You can do server discovery. You can even do sort of migration activities of planning with things like database migration services. So there's a bit of stuff that AWS is providing, and often some of these are at almost no cost to you. There's no additional licensing other than some of the infrastructure that it provisions in your AWS account. So I would start initially looking at see what the AWS tooling can provide, and if you need more, then you can look at something more commercial. Would you recommend any online resources for acquiring AWS skills? The answer to this is, I think there's no shortage of it. I would answer this very personally. I think this is very different depending on how you like to learn and what's your preferred way of doing things. If I look back to my 3-4 years in AWS and how I have learned that, I have often relied heavily on some of the AWS material. AWS does a very good job of documentation. Some of the videos from re:Invent are pretty good and are good learning material. If you need something more structured, then things like Linux Academy, Udemy provide good online resources from a skills perspective. And so I would look at those things. It depends on how you want to learn. If you prefer classroom-based training, then you probably have to look at some training partners like Global Knowledge or so forth. But typically, if I look at Rackspace as well, we use some of these things ourselves for our own skills as well. Next question is, would you consider containerization to be an important method to move legacy application? That's a tricky question. It's hard to answer that without specifics of the application. Containerization in itself means there's a degree of transformation that happen. If you're treating containers like a lightweight virtual machine, that usually means you're setting up yourself for failure later on. So I wouldn't say they're an easy answer, but in some cases, you could look at that and say, okay, I'm going to figure out a way to containerize these things and then move them out. But the fact is, if you can containerize them, you could also put them on virtual machine. So in some sense, the problems that come with just moving to AWS would apply even when you're moving to containers. I don't think they're an easy answer for that. The next question was, custom and legacy applications are almost always challenging to go to cloud. They need specific environment variables. What would you recommend for custom legacy applications? I'm trying to understand this question a bit when with specific to what specific environment variables means. That could mean several things in several contexts. But if I were to make an assumption that the environment variables here is more about getting information to these applications in terms of being able to discover services, for example, and so forth, in there, the answer to this would depend on how you're doing that today. If you have some sort of service discovery tool, maybe using DNS for those things or elements of that, then you could easily move that in a similar fashion into AWS. There are other things like service discovery tooling that AWS provides as well, so you could potentially migrate into that. But that also assumes that your legacy applications are able to leverage tooling like that, which may not be the case. But the simplest answer would be, what are you doing today, and see why that won't run. Because at the end of the day, if you're looking at an on-premise setup, it usually consists of physical servers, virtual machines, maybe you have some configuration management tools like Chef or Puppet that are doing some bits. Most of those can be ported over to AWS in a relatively seamless fashion, and you can transpose some of those applications into either comparable services on AWS or run them yourself on a virtual machine. Okay, I think that answers all the questions that were in there. If there's any more, feel free to pop it in now. I'll give people another minute about it. Okay, I think Vinod says, by custom legacy apps, I mean apps developed in-house. So even in the apps developed in-house case, what are they running on today would be my answer. Okay, you're getting more specific. So things like Windows NT 2000, yes. So those do become a bit of a challenge because some of these things, especially if you're looking going as back as Windows NT, which has been end of life for a long time, those can be challenging to some extent because those are, for example, those images, machine images, are not available today via Amazon, for example. Microsoft won't provide any support from it. The by-the-book answer to that would be, I would say, consider migrating them away because you're already running on a ticking time bomb. If you're running something on NT or 2000, eventually something like compliance or security is going to bite you. So the best answer is to migrate that away into that. If you can't do it and you're forced to it for a variety of reasons, there are some options. So if you just look into the AWS toolkit, but look at VMware, and if you look at the partnership that AWS has with VMware in sort of what they're building, the VMware Cloud or VMC, might be a good starting point for some of these legacy applications because often these things would run fine on a VMware sort of stack. So you could sort of consume them via the VMware Cloud on AWS. And then the way that cloud works, if you're not familiar with this, you're still running sort of vCenter, you're running your ESX hypervisors and everything. So everything looks exactly like it would look on an on-premise VMware setup, but in AWS data centers. But then you also have a bridge into all the other AWS services. So you could still consume Elastic Block Storage, for example, or DynamoDB, for example, or Lambda. So you could consume all the other services as well. So that may be a good starting point for some of these things where you put them into something like a VMware cloud environment and then figure out pathways to either modernize them from an operating system perspective or migrate them over to something more native on AWS. Hopefully that helped. Any more questions, let me know. Okay, in that case, thank you for the time. This session will be recorded and will be made available for you. So if you want to share this with your colleagues and other people in your teams, feel free to do it. Again, there's information on the screen, and the information will be shared after this via email as well, where if you have further questions, if you want to reach out to Rackspace for help with any of these things, or you want to just have a high-level discussion on some of the things like CCOE that we talked about today, we are available. You'll get the information on how to reach out to us. And of course, you can reach out to me directly as well, and I can put you in touch with the right people. Thanks for your time, and have a good day.